Hi guys and welcome back. We're going to continue talking about chapter 31 and our sort of look at art from 1945 to 1980. When we last left off, we were looking at pop art and especially the art of Andy Warhol. We're going to continue that really quickly and then get started on some other things. But as you guys remember, pop art is this movement that sort of celebrated American, well, really not just American, but modern popular culture. And this includes everything from celebrities to consumer goods and products. And it also separated itself from the other big movement of the time, abstract expressionism, by embracing humor and irony. And we can certainly see that in the work of Claes Oldenburg, who is the great sculptor of the pop art movement. And Oldenburg's sculptures are often humorous because they take sort of everyday objects, stuff that is just the everyday materials of modern society, tubes of lipstick, matchbooks, and he blows them up on monumental proportions in the same way, you know, a sculptor might make a massive monumental sculpture of a hero or a great leader. For Oldenburg, he wants to celebrate the mundane things of modern life, like matchbooks and lipsticks, often in a very sort of humorous way. Especially if you look at the image of the lipstick on the left, it is sort of a weird hybrid between a tube of lipstick and tank treads, the sort of caterpillar treads on a tank. And, you know, in a way, this could maybe reference how, you know, makeup is a kind of armor that protects people from sort of he could be sort of referring here that maybe makeup is a kind of armor that is worn, at the time principally by women as a way of protecting themselves in social situations or whatever. But he is certainly displaying a sense of humor here by taking these rather mundane, everyday objects and sort of blowing them up on a monumental scale, and that kind of celebration and at the same time mocking of modern consumerist culture is what pop art is really all about. Superrealism is an offshoot of pop art, and the superrealists were fascinated by popular culture, just like pop artists were. But their approach is a little different because they were at their heart also realists. They wanted to paint in a very realistic style. And in many ways, photography is one of the biggest influence on the superrealists. They didn't usually paint from real life. They're not painting from live models or still lifes that they're setting up in a studio, but instead they would take pictures of things and then paint the photograph. They're influenced by photography here. So with the superrealists, we see a lot of the same concerns, though, as the pop artist, modern consumer culture and society. The superrealists often painted with a new device called an airbrush, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a brush that's powered by air, and it gets this really smooth, commercial, artificial, photographic kind of look. This is a painting by Audrey Flack, who's one of the great superrealists, and her art often has allusions, references to classic art of the Renaissance and the Baroque. And this is a painting of Marilyn Monroe, of course, one of the favorite subjects of pop artists. And she is painting this kind of still life with images of Marilyn Monroe and sort of things associated with beauty. But if you look closely, you'll start to notice there's some things like, a rotting fruit, or a candle burning out, or how the makeup on the brush resembles a drop of blood, or an image of a hourglass with time running out, or a calendar, with the days of the week sort of ticking away. And you realize what you're looking at is actually a kind of vanitas painting. Remember vanitas paintings from our look at the Dutch Baroque? And We talked about how these paintings that were filled with what we call memento moris, these reminders of death, that Vanitas paintings were meant to sort of remind us of our own vanity. And so she is drawing very heavily from kind of art history here, but in this very modern kind of way, in this very super realistic or photorealistic, as it's sometimes called, style. Now, Chuck Close is another super realist, and his work is strikingly photographic. You are looking at paintings. You are not looking at photographs. Well, technically, you're looking at a photograph of a painting, but you know what I mean. But Chuck Close painted these often large-scale, usually large-scale paintings, and he often painted people with sort of no expressions on their face. Chuck Close was fascinated by the human face because he was actually born with a neurological condition called face blindness. And he cannot recognize faces, or cannot recognize faces very well. This is a real condition. There's actually a part of our brain that is dedicated to recognizing faces. And some people, because of either genetics or because of a brain trauma, things like strokes or even, concussions and things like that, can actually cause face blindness, and he cannot recognize even people who he knows well. He can't recognize their face. He has to, hear their voice or look at the way they're dressed or other kinds of visual clues. And so he's fascinated with the face because it's actually kind of a big mystery to him. Chuck Close, though, in the 1980s had a really horrific thing happen to him. In, I believe it was 1988, Chuck Close had just lectured, and as he was crossing the street after giving this lecture, he collapses, and it turned out he had an artery on his spine burst. And it's this super rare condition that hardly ever happens, but it paralyzed him, and he lost all movement of his legs. He has very limited movement in his arms, and he cannot really grip a brush. He had a studio specially designed that allowed him to move the easel around by remote control, where he could sort of lift and move it around and stuff. But he still can't really paint with the precision. If you look at his hands, you'll notice that he has braces on his hands. So he can't really paint with the precision that he needed to create these photorealistic, super realistic images. So he had to switch to something that was simpler for him to paint. But in a weird way, the paintings that he created are inherently more complex because he uses a form of optical mixing. And you guys should remember optical mixing from when we talked about Georges Seurat and pointillism. And so, for example, if Georges Seurat wanted to create the color green, he would take blue dots and yellow dots and put them next to each other, and then when you stood far away, those dots would mix and you would see green. So Chuck Close does something very similar, but in a more complex way. Instead of using simple dots, he's using these sort of organic shapes. And what's amazing is when you look at one of these grid squares, you'll notice the colors aren't colors we normally associate with human skin tones. I mean, we see like fluorescent greens and neon yellows and fuchsia and things that no human skin really has. And yet, when you stand away, they blend together. Your eye optically mixes them and you see skin tone. It's pretty incredible stuff. Chuck Close in many ways is making sort of two paintings here. When you stand up close, you're seeing a very abstract sort of painting, something that Clement Greenberg, remember that guy, would have loved. But when you pull away, all of a sudden those abstract kinds of forms blend together and create a representational image. It's unbelievable. Like, I've been teaching Chuck Close for a decade and a half now, and I still don't understand how he does what he does. It's next level kind of stuff, guys. Moving on. Lucian Freud. Yes, he's related to Sigmund Freud. In fact, he was the grandson of Sigmund Freud. Lucian Freud is a German artist whose family fled Berlin when Hitler rose to power. and he lived and worked mostly in London. Lucian Freud, like his grandfather, was interested in the human condition and the human psyche. And his work has a very sort of deep psychological kind of bent to it. Lucian Freud paints nudes. A very traditional subject matter, as you guys know, in Western art, but he paints nudes in a very different way. He doesn't paint heroic, beautiful sort of nudes. He doesn't paint nudes that are meant to be seen as sensual or sexual, and he doesn't use the nude to confront us in the same way that Manet did. But instead, Lucian Freud is more interested in trying to kind of literally strip away the trappings of society. Not just our clothes, although that's part of it, but our pretenses, right? When we interact in public, you might be depressed at home, but you put on a happy face in public. And Lucian Freud wants to strip all of that away and sort of expose an individual like almost you're exposing a raw nerve. He often put his figures into awkward positions. They often have looks of distress or sadness or sometimes even boredom on their faces. And I think he's sort of playing also with the idea that, when we're alone, we take all of those pretenses, all of those things that we put on for society, not just our clothes, but our attitudes and everything else. And when we're home, all that stuff is stripped away, sometimes literally. His figures are usually alone and isolated figures, which I think at the time this is being recorded, we are in the COVID-19 self-isolating lockdown, and I think we can all kind of understand. Okay. But he reinvented really the way nude bodies were depicted in Western art. He kind of took the glamour away from it and instead used nudity as a way to literally expose people's minds and their psyches and their souls. Duane Hanson is another artist obsessed with the human figure. He's another super realist. He is fascinated, like the pop artists are, by popular culture and consumer society. He developed a sculptural technique where he would literally cast the bodies of his models. And he usually used everyday sort of looking people, and he would cast their bodies and then make a mold out of that, and then using a polyester resin and fiberglass, he would create these very lifelike sculptures. And the way he displayed them was unique too, because he would use the actual clothing of the models that he paid, and then he would also give them items and things to do. And so when you go to see a Duane Hanson exhibit, it's really unnerving, because at first it's hard to tell what is the art and who are the spectators looking at the art. And especially like the image of the cleaning woman on the left, where you walk into a gallery and you're not sure, is she a person who works here? Should I be looking at her? Should I be staring at her? Is she going to get upset? And then you realize, oh, she hasn't moved in 5 minutes. This is the art. He literally sort of blurs the line between art and reality. But he often, like Lucian Freud, sort of paints or sculpts. I got there, guys. He sculpts his figures in a way that they often are not, they're not paying attention to their surroundings. They're lost in their own mind or their own thoughts. And they're sort of frozen in time that way. And we are sort of staring at these people who are unguarded and withdrawn into themselves. So feminist art. In the 1970s, we see the full feminist movement in full swing. Of course, the 1960s and 70s brought deep changes to American culture with the civil rights movement of the 60s and the women's equality movement of the 60s and 70s. And there was a real desire for people who had been often marginalized in contemporary society to search for equality. And in the feminist movement, we see artists often commenting on the role of women in art. Because as we've talked about before, it was often very difficult for women to have a career in art. And in some areas, at certain parts and at certain times in history, it was impossible. And so what we're seeing here is women not only asserting themselves as artists, but also reevaluating women's roles in artists. And it was because of the feminist art movement of the 70s that artists like Artemisia Gentileschi were sort of rediscovered, and Judith Leister and some of these other artists who weren't even in art history textbooks in the 70s, we now study, and we have now reevaluated and are now considered some of the greatest artists of their day. But because they were women, they weren't included. Your textbook, Gardner's Art Through the Ages, actually talks about this phenomenon, and how, like, if you look at like the editions of the book from the 70s and you look at the Baroque period, there is no Artemisia Gentileschi, right? There is no Judith Leister. And it is only, in the last few decades that women have not only been allowed to participate more in the art world, but who are historical women artists have been now reevaluated and recognized for their contributions to art. Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party is a monumental, what we call an installation, meaning that it is a work of art that transforms an entire space. And The Dinner Party, in some ways, is a play on one of the most famous paintings of all time, The Last Supper, because each side of this triangle has 13 settings. But this isn't really a comment on religion so much as it is a comment on women's role in art. And for Judy Chicago, this is sort of metaphorically giving women a seat at the table of sort of art history. And each side contains 13 settings with 39 place settings in total. Each place setting is dedicated to a specific woman from history. Some of them artists, but some of them rulers and leaders, and some of them are more like fictional or mythological kinds of figures. Others are very real, but these are all women who have influenced culture and society. On the floor is what's called the heritage floor, which contains 999 other names written or inscribed in tile, so honoring other women from history. The works are made primarily with craft materials, things like ceramics. Ceramic primarily dominates the materials used. And this was an intentional move on Judy Chicago's part, because for many, many, many years, painting and sculpture was men's art. And things like ceramics and fiber arts like weaving and things like that were women's crafts. And by using quote-unquote crafts instead of fine art, she is trying to legitimize things like ceramics and weaving and tapestry and embroidery as a legitimate fine art. So she's like, yeah, I'm not gonna paint. I want you guys to recognize that ceramics are art. Let's take a closer look. This is a work that is monumental in its scope and size, and Judy Chicago did not make every place setting herself. She hired ceramicists and weavers and people to help her create this. And she has, as you enter, she has a large wall, and this is in the Brooklyn Museum of Art in Brooklyn, New York. She has a large wall kind of honoring all of the people who contributed to this project. And this, in a way, also is a reaction against traditional men's art, because, men have always relied on workshops. Think about, we've talked about Raphael and Rubens, who had these massive workshops. And sometimes there's disputes on whether a painting was made by the master artist or whether it was actually made by one of the students. And this is a problem with works from everybody from Rembrandt to Leonardo to, Rubens, where there's arguments that, no, this was made by a student in the style of the master artist, because the master artist generally took all the credit. But Judy Chicago wants to break away from that, what she sees as kind of a male tradition, and highlight everybody who contributed to this work of art. Because part of it is, she's arguing here that women have often, through history, and worked in groups. They have worked in tandem with other women, whether it's women working to weave a giant tapestry, but oftentimes women worked in large workshop sort of environments. So she wants to, in many ways, also legitimize this idea that art can be a collaboration. It's not just one guy doing all the work, but often it requires the work and contributions of many people, and especially large-scale works. When we look at each place setting, you'll notice that the plates resemble women's genitalia. They resemble the vulva. And this is once again intentional, because Judy Chicago wants you to be aware that this is women's art. But there are also flowers too, right? And you'll notice that these floral shapes, some of them are larger and more three-dimensional than others. And it's because through time, because if this is laid out like a triangle, through time, the plates get more three-dimensional and the flowers blossom more, because this is meant to represent women's contributions to society, and more importantly, their recognition in society sort of blossoms. But if you look at any one of these, you will see that she is using primarily women's crafts material here. She's using embroidery, she's using ceramics, she's using weaving and tapestry techniques. These are all materials and methods associated with women's art. Once again, trying to legitimize these as real fine art forms. And if you want to explore this more, I highly recommend going to the Brooklyn Museum of Art webpage, and there's an entire page dedicated, or entire set group of pages dedicated to this, that breaks down every place setting and every woman and gives a really in-depth biography of everybody honored here. But as you can see, there's women artists like Georgia O'Keeffe and Artemisia Gentileschi. For those of you who took my class last year, the medieval artist Hildegard von Bingen is recognized here. But, figures from ancient history like Hypatia, who was an astronomer and librarian at the great Library of Alexandria, to the American poet Emily Dickinson, to Judith, the Jewish woman who beheads Holofernes, as we saw in Artemisia's painting. Here's a list of everybody if you want to freeze frame this, but this is only a Google away. It's a Google away, guys. Continuing to look at feminist art of the 1970s, let's take a look now at Cindy Sherman, who is, I would consider, still one of the most influential artists working today. Cindy Sherman is a photographer who created a series of what she called untitled film stills. Now, some of you are more than likely too young to know what a film still is. I mean, it's at its simplest definition, a film still is a picture taken from a movie. But, people used to collect these, actually. You could buy them at shops and even at movie theaters. And especially in the days before home media, VHS, CDs, Blu-rays, whatever, certainly streaming, people would often buy and collect these 8x10 film stills. And Cindy Sherman decided to make a series of film stills for movies that never existed. Not only did these films not exist, but they're untitled. So why is Cindy Sherman doing this? Well, what she's doing in her film still series is she is playing various roles. Even though she is the star, if you will, of every one of these photographs, these are not self-portraits. She is not portraying herself, but instead portraying a character. Cindy Sherman would often dress in costumes, wear wigs, and sort of take on kind of stereotypical women's roles that she was familiar with in movies from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And by sort of playing with these stereotypes, the kinds of women's roles that were often seen in these kinds of movies, but also by not giving us the name of the film, she's sort of relying on us, the viewer, to fill in the gaps. So in many ways, these photographs are kind of almost a more of a form of self-examination for us, the viewer, because we immediately, once we start looking at these pictures, based on who we are, based on the kinds of films we watch, based on our sort of views of women, we start filling in the gaps and the blanks, and we start assigning roles to Cindy Sherman. She's not really giving us anything besides a character and a costume, and we're providing the plot. It's almost kind of like a visual Mad Lib, if you think about it, because she's just given us a blank, and we fill in the meaning. She says, in college, I began to collect a lot of discarded accoutrements from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, more for my own personal wardrobe as well for the sheer fascination with what those garments stood for. It was easy and cheap to collect all kinds of things in those days. I've always played with makeup to transform myself, but everything, including the lighting, was self-taught. I just learned things as I needed them. I absorbed my ideas from the women in these photos from every cultural source that I've ever had access to, including film, TV, advertisements, magazines, as well as any adult role models from my youth. She's taking these kind of common depictions of women, like the housewife, or maybe the mistress, as we see in this image here. Here we see a young girl on the side of the road. These are all kind of stereotypical women's roles from movies at this time. Here we see sort of a young woman in the city, which would have been common in films by the director Alfred Hitchcock at the time, with the similar costumes and things like that. She's also playing, the role of the stereotypical bad girl, another housewife. Here she is, another sort of young woman on her own. And you'll notice that in some of these images, let me go back to the first one here. If you look at the floor, you can see there's a cord. And that is the trigger for the shutter on the camera. So she's intentionally leaving in aspects of the whole photography and filmmaking process here. She is reinforcing the whole idea that this is a fiction, that what we are seeing is not real. It is a story, but the only difference is that we're providing the narrative. So we can see the cord in this image. If you look at this picture here at the bottom, you can see that she is in front of what is called a rear projection, which was a common way in old movies to create, backgrounds if they couldn't shoot on location. So she is playing with the whole idea that films are made up. Films are stories that we tell. But she is sort of taking it sort of one layer deeper here to a more feminist level, where she's examining the way we portray women in those stories. And she's also, and I think in a bigger picture here, playing with the whole idea of what the experience of looking at art is. And we've already talked about how Duchamp said, artists don't make art, the viewer makes the art. And I think Cindy Sherman is very much reinforcing this idea, because we all come to, anything we encounter with our own preconceived notions and sometimes prejudices, but certainly with our own points of view. And I could show this class, you know, of all 30 of you, 30 different works of art, and I would have 30 different interpretations on that one work of art. And Cindy Sherman is sort of playing with that fact that it is ultimately the viewer, not the artist, who makes the meaning of a work of art. It's pretty cool stuff. Cindy Sherman works on multiple layers, which I've always loved, and I think that, you know, I hope you guys are getting that. So let's look at another artist associated with the feminist movement in the 1970s, and that is Ana Mendieta. Ana Mendieta is a Cuban-born artist whose family fled Cuba under Castro, and she lived most of her young life in the United States. Ana Mendieta is an artist who is often associated with a kind of art that we call performance art. And we'll talk a little more about this later on in this chapter, but performance art is, instead of focusing on an object, the art is a performance. It is an event. It is an action performed by the artist. But where this differs from, like, say, theater, right, is the idea that you're not necessarily telling a narrative story, or you're not creating a sort of fictional situation, but instead you are performing this event, and the event itself is the art. Ana Mendieta was very interested, had very deep ecological concerns. She was... a lot of her work deals with the destruction of natural areas, but it's also about the connection between human beings and nature. She created a whole sort of series called Silhouettes, where she would insert her body into natural landscapes and sort of try to create a connection between bodies, and especially women's bodies, and the natural world. A lot of her imagery deals with things like concepts like growth and fertility, often images of flowers and things growing, kind of connecting sort of ancient concepts of like fertility goddesses and earth mothers and things like that with the land itself. A lot of her work was performed out in the middle of nowhere, often to, you know, very few people, or sometimes in many cases no people. And so her art mainly exists as photographs, but she's not a photographer because she is not using a photograph itself as the work of art. It is simply recording the event that occurred, which was the work of art. Yeah, Annie, it's weird, huh? Okay, so a little thing I have to add, I normally don't like to dwell too much on the tragic, but it is definitely part of her story and has contributed to interest in her all these years later. In the 1980s, Ana Mendieta, I believe 1985, married an artist named Carl Andre, and they evidently had a very tempestuous relationship, and she fell out of off the balcony of her 34th floor apartment. There was evidence of foul play. She had scratches on her arm. The neighbors reported hearing arguments. However, Carl Andre was acquitted. He was not judged in front of a jury, but it was a judge-only trial, and he was acquitted. To this day, there's a lot of controversy surrounding him and people who have actively banned his work. Moving on to something a little happier, let's take a look at Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright, in some ways, is sort of like the Picasso of architecture, in that his career spanned a good chunk of the 20th century, and he was working well into the 1940s and 50s. One of his last great work is the Guggenheim Museum in New York. funded by Solomon R. Guggenheim, the industrialist, but his wife Peggy Guggenheim, who was Jackson Pollock's matron or patron, for instance, was a big reason why he invested into this museum, because she was one of the great sort of patrons of the arts. The Guggenheim Museum is based on organic shapes. It is based on the shape of a snail's shell. It doesn't really blend into the environment like his earlier works do, like the Roby House and especially Falling Water. In fact, if you've ever been to New York, which is mostly sort of a grid-like skyscrapers sort of stretching up into the air, it really sort of sticks out like a sore thumb. Some of its critics thought that it looked a little too much like a toilet bowl. I think that's a little unfair. However, it is a very strange building, and it is somewhat impractical for a museum. Inside the building is a continuous spiral, so there aren't most viewers visiting the museum won't walk up a series of steps, but instead they'll sort of walk up this kind of endless spiraling ramp, which is all well and good, except for the fact that the floor is constantly at an angle, and the art isn't. So when you look at art on the wall, there's always a slight sort of difference between how you're standing, which is slightly at a slope, and how the art is positioned on the walls. But it still deals with a lot of the same sort of concepts that Frank Lloyd Wright have been dealing with in his architecture since the very beginning, especially this idea of flow, of trying to create a continuous flow from one room to another. And this, in many ways, takes that to its extreme, right, by creating this sort of endless spiral form. Another early modernist artist who was still working into the middle of the century was Le Corbusier. Remember his machine for living and his sort of very regimented modernist architecture. Here we are seeing a very different, a very different kind of architecture. Here we're seeing something with a lot more organic forms. Le Corbusier designed this church, Notre Dame du Haut. In many ways, Le Corbusier is drawing from medieval architecture here, with the thick sort of walls of a Romanesque architecture, but also the sort of pointed kinds of elements that one would find in the Gothic. And like those medieval buildings, he designed this on a very strict sort of mathematical system. If we look inside the church, you can see another sort of reference to the Middle Ages with the use of stained glass windows. This work utilized several new building techniques. It has a mesh wire frame, and then it is a concrete structure, and the concrete was actually sort of blown onto the mesh frame underneath. But really, this work exist almost as a building, but also as a giant sort of modernist sculpture with its sort of swooping sail-like roof. Speaking of swooping sail-like roofs, here is Danish architect Joran Utzon, Sydney Opera House. This is, of course, the very famous building in harbour of Sydney, Australia. The shape of this building is meant to commemorate and sort of evoke the vessels that sailed to Australia, bringing the first settlers. It is also meant to sort of resemble that of a seagull, and also references here Gothic architecture with its pointed arch-like shapes. But like, all sort of modernist architecture, there's a real emphasis on sort of bold, clear, geometric shapes, no ornamentation, sort of simple sort of shapes. But here what we're seeing is something a little more complex with Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum, Corbusier's Notre Dame du Haut, and the Sydney Opera House. We're seeing an increasing complexity as we get deeper into the modernist era. So we're still seeing those basic sort of geometric forms and lack of ornamentation, but the overall designs of these buildings are much more complex than sort of the early structures of the Bauhaus or the Stil or even Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright's earlier designs. They're getting much more complex. Now, we can't talk about modernist architecture without talking about skyscrapers. And we can go all the way back to Louis Sullivan in the late 19th century and look at the development of the skyscraper. Because the skyscraper in many ways is synonymous with the modern world, right? And modern society, and certainly modern technology and modern building materials. Because it was modern building materials that allowed the earliest architects of these things to build these monumental kind of cathedrals to capitalism, as they were sometimes called. On the right is a building by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, commonly called Mies van der Rohe, and Philip Johnson, two pioneers of the modern skyscraper. And Mies van der Rohe, in many ways, is sort of credited with the modernist motto, which is less is more, right? Strip everything down to its basic components, its basic geometric forms, and let those materials be themselves, right? So let steel be steel, let glass be glass, and don't put ornamentation on anything. And you've all been, to Dallas or, many other big cities where these kinds of skyscrapers are ubiquitous, these big glass and steel, 30, 40, 50 and above story buildings that are almost skeletal in the way they look, right? It almost looks like the skeleton, the frame is on the outside. I mean, that is textbook truth to materials, isn't it? They're letting the actual materials be the design. And whether we're looking at Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson, two, once again, of the giants of modernist skyscraper architecture, or we're looking at the very famous, I will always call it the Sears Tower because I'm old, but it's called the Willis Tower now, but it will always be the Sears Tower to me. You can't take that away from me, because it was, when I was a kid, it was the tallest building in the world. It's been since surpassed by several buildings, but it's still a massive monumental structure. And the Sears Tower is, in many ways, a cluster of smaller skyscrapers embedded into each other. But it's basically a bunch of rectangles, and that is sort of the modernist aesthetic, this sort of simplicity of design. And now let's go to postmodern architecture, because this is where things get kind of weird. Because postmodernism is a reaction against modernist formalism. In other words, formalism, right? What does that mean? It means an interest in form, an interest in shape, an interest in line, an interest in the sort of building blocks of a work of art. That's why everybody reduced things to simple sort of geometric kinds of forms. And this was sort of seen as elitist. It was seen as sort of removed from popular taste. And so most postmodernism was a reaction. It was a rejection of that sort of austere, strict formalism. And postmodernism instead offered a wide range of styles, subjects, and formats. Postmodernism often is ironic and funny and reveals sort of a self-conscious awareness. In many ways, it's kind of, pop art is really a form of postmodernism, or at least kind of the steps towards postmodernism. But generally, many architects thought modernist architecture was impersonal. It was too conformist. It lacked self-expression. How can you express yourself with a box, right? And so postmodernism is all the things that modernism isn't. It is expressive. It often uses ornamentation. It often is very individualistic. It's very easy to tell a modernist, one postmodernist architect from another postmodernist architect. The first postmodernist building is designed by the architect Robert Venturi, and it was a house that he designed for his mother, originally designing it in 1962. And if we look at this structure, we can see that it has some modernist elements. It is based mostly on sort of basic geometric shapes, triangles, squares, rectangles, that sort of thing. But a lot of the elements of this house don't have a function. They don't, the design of the house does not, golly, I'm tired. But a lot of the elements of the house aren't necessary for the function or the overall structure of the house, which, remember, is sort of one of the basic tenets of modernism, is that you're not supposed to have anything unnecessary. You know, form follows the function. You decide what a building is supposed to be used, and then you design around that function without any ornamentation, without any sort of whimsy or self-expression. You're literally kind of going from point A to point B in the most simplest form possible, with the belief that there is something pure and perfect and rational about this kind of architecture. But if you look at this work, you'll see that there's a lot of things that don't make sense. Like, for example, we have this triangle, which in many ways reflects the shape of a Greek pediment. You know, first of all, what is a Greek pediment doing on a modernist-looking house? Second of all, why doesn't the pediment connect? Why is it opened in a way so you can see the chimney? Well, that's why. Robert Ventura liked the chimney and he wanted you to see it, so he sort of broke this triangular shape in two pieces for no real reason except for aesthetic reasons, but it has nothing to do with the function of the house. Then we have this line here sort of representing an arch, but there is no arch here. In fact, there is no arch necessary because we have a sort of post and lintel opening into the house. And, you know, this house is also sort of asymmetrical. It's oddly designed. It in many ways, you know, if modern architecture is meant not to draw attention to itself, it's meant to sort of blend in its surroundings, and its function is the most important thing. This house does nothing but draw attention to itself. But I think if you really want to understand postmodern architecture, we need to take a look at Charles Moore, Piazza d'Italia, which is in New Orleans and was built in from 1976 to 1980. And this, to me, is what postmodernism is about. It's irreverent, it's whimsical, it's funny, and it sort of takes a junkyard approach to architecture. You'll notice that this structure is made up of elements from all sorts of different eras. We have, you know, Corinthian columns from ancient Greece. We you know, this whole building, or this whole structure, is a forum based on ancient Roman forums, meeting places for ancient Romans. And we see some of those elements, right? We see Corinthian columns, we see arches. But the overall design seems haphazard and irregular, not like a typical Roman forum. There's also elements that appear modernist, like the sort of the striped forms in the fountain here. There are other elements that are more like sort of the undulating facade of a Baroque. There are Renaissance elements here. There are modernist elements in here. It's kind of a hodgepodge. And then the whole, you know, even though it's based on a Roman forum, the colors used, these sort of bright yellows and, you know, salmon-y, orangey pinks, aren't, of course, you know, typical of any period, really, of art. And he's also using materials that aren't related to sort of Roman plazas at all. Like here we have a Greek Doric style column, but it's made out of sheet metal, right? We also have, this weird mismatch here. We have a flying buttress, from the Gothic period, but flying buttresses were designed to hold up and support walls. This is simply there for ornamentation. I mean, this whole structure is really more designed for effect and to sort of get a reaction from people who are seeing it. But one of the main elements of postmodernism is that it takes the past and reevaluates it. One of the ideas of postmodernism is it says that, well, let me put it this way. The whole concept of modernism is that we're going to move forward. Modernism is always about what's next, what's going to be the next thing. We always have to come up with something new. And postmodernism basically says, there ain't nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. We can't come up with anything else. But what we can do is take what came before and rearrange it and remix it and come up with a new way of utilizing this old stuff. And this isn't just a trend in postmodernist architecture. This is going to be a trend in postmodernist art, postmodernist film, postmodernist literature, because postmodernism is a period of reevaluation. Postmodernism literally means it's after modernism. And if modernism is always about coming up with the next big thing, postmodernism says, wait, why? Why this need for something new all the time when we really can't do anything else new? We've reduced our buildings to boxes, right? Made of glass and steel. We can't move anymore in that direction. So maybe we should look back at the past and reevaluate what came before. So postmodernist architecture starts to catch on in the late 70s and 80s. And we even see architects like Philip Johnson, the modernist architect who is one of the fathers of sort of the modern skyscraper, sort of rejecting this. And he said that, you have to reject structural honesty in favor of ornamentation. In other words, what's wrong with a little pizzazz, right? We can't all live in metal boxes for the rest of our lives. And so, for example, in this structure, the AT&T Tower, now the Sony building, we see a building that is, by all means, more or less like a modern skyscraper. However, it's made of brick instead of glass and steel. And if you look at the top of it, we see another Greek-style pediment with a break in it. Just like Robert Venturi's house for his mother. And so we see sort of, once again, this sort of mismatch of styles. We see classical architecture and modernist architecture sort of jammed in and crammed into each other. Michael Graves' Portland building is often considered to be the first, or one of the first, modernist skyscrapers. It's a tall building, but it breaks the rules of skyscrapers. Instead of emphasizing its height, it emphasizes its width. Also, instead of being made up entirely of glass, it's made up of these tiny little windows, more common in maybe some medieval architecture. Also, you can see it's taken the idea of the Greek Doric column, but it's turned it into this giant sort of modernist version of a Greek Doric column. And in fact, the whole side of the building sort of reflects a much larger Greek column. But once again, we're getting a sort of mismatch of styles. And also what we're seeing that we haven't seen a lot in modernist architecture, color. Color, guys. We're seeing, this sort of really sort of brilliant sort of pinky orange color. We're seeing this sort of pale blue. Modernists said architecture must reflect its function and its materials. And if you're making a building out of steel and glass, you don't need to paint it. And postmodernists say, why not? We like paint. Paint's fun. We like color. We like taking all of these funky things that aren't supposed to go together, like Greek architecture and modernist architecture and all these brilliant colors and kind of throwing it together as a form of self-expression, as a way of standing out from all of the other big glass rectangles that are sort of clogging up our cities. I think one of the most fascinating of the postmodernist buildings is a building called the Pompidou building. This is a museum in Paris, and it is a building that is literally turned inside out. All of the parts that are normally supposed to be hidden, so things like electrical conduits, AC vents, the structure of the building itself is on the outside of the building, and then the inside of the building actually looks like the outside. This is a nightmare of a building to maintain, evidently. It has to be constantly repainted and cleaned because these vents and things like that weren't made to be on the outside of a building. They were made to be on the inside of a building. But this building literally turns the concept of modern architecture inside out. And it's, in itself, the very design is meant to be sort of a joke. It's playful, it's funny, it's exciting for the viewer, it's a bit of a head scratcher, and it's a lot of fun to look at. This is a building I've actually visited a few times, and you can't help but smile and laugh when you look at this ridiculous inside-out building. And that playfulness and fun and literally that sort of desire to kind of turn modernist architecture on its head, or inside out in this case, is a big part of understanding postmodernism. So let's look now at another major trend in art in the 1970s, and this is called earthworks, or sometimes you'll see the term land art. I'm going to use the terms interchangeably. But this was, in very, very much like Anna Mendieta's art, the earthwork artists and land artists had deep concerns about the environment and ecology. And a lot of their art was designed specifically to draw our attention to the land, to the point where they actually made art with the land itself. And of course, they're also going back, way back to, ancient architecture that was made from the materials available in any given area. So, things like, Stonehenge, for example, or the mounds architecture of the ancient Americas, or any, take your pick. There's many, many ancient monuments made out of rocks and dirt and whatever available materials there were, that in many ways become more just an extension of the land. Robert Smithson is an artist who unfortunately died not too long after this work, Spiral Jetty, was completed. Horribly died in a plane accident while surveying another site. But this is a giant spiral. It is what it's what it says on the packaging, right? It's called Spiral Jetty, and it's a jetty in the shape of a spiral. And it is a massive jetty in the shape of the spiral. It is, about a third of a mile long if you stretched it out. You could drive a vehicle on this thing. This is located in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And Smithson designed this whole jetty to erode. In fact, at various times over the last 40 some odd years, 50 years, it has sort of rose and sunk into the lake. And there are times where you can't even see it. And this is part of Smithson's plan, because he wanted this work to be, to draw our attention from nature, but he didn't want to destroy nature. He didn't want to scar the land. And eventually this thing will erode. It will go back to where it came from, existing just for a small moment. It can still be seen very easily from air, by the way. So if you're ever flying over on certain flights heading west, you can actually see Spiral Jetty if you go over this Great Salt Lake. But so why a spiral, though? Why this shape in particular? Well, because it's a very old symbol. In fact, Here are three examples of spirals from, and one is from the ancient Bronze Age, and I'm sorry I don't have a date, but this is around 6000 BC. There's a Minoan vase here that that is not Minoan. Why did I mark it Minoan? Ah. So why a spiral? So why a spiral? Why did Robert Smithson use this particular shape? Because it's a very old and commonly used form. We have examples of the spiral being used in very ancient civilizations. So, for example, the image on the upper right is from Bronze Age Ireland, which is about 6,000 years old, this thing. Here's an example from ancient China from 1200 BC. Here's a Cycladic, which is near the Greek peninsula, dating back around 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. So this is really old stuff. And spirals are common symbols in cultures all around the world. And in most of these cultures, spirals relate to water. The idea of sort of a whirlpool or the swirling motion of water. And this, of course, relates to life, because water is a symbol of life. It is the necessity for life. And so Smithson has taken this ancient sort of religious symbol, the spiritual symbol of water. And what is more appropriate than in this Great Salt Lake than a giant spiral representing water itself and representing sort of the spiritual qualities of water. But also, if you look on the left, you can see an image of a salt crystal magnified a lot. I don't remember how many times. And you can see that it forms, oh my God, a spiral. So what we're looking at is Smithson is referring not only to sort of the spiritual quality of the spiral, but also the scientific sort of existence of the spiral within water itself, or within salt water, which the Great Salt Lake happens to have a lot of. So, what we're looking at here is kind of a coming together of art and science in this sort of massive work, which is meant to really sort of raise our awareness, raise our awareness of our environment and of the world around us. And maybe if we have that awareness, we can connect to things both sort of rationally and scientifically, and also in a spiritual way. Performance art. Performance art I mentioned a little earlier, but let's take a long look at this. Performance art is, well, art where the performance is the main function. And we can actually trace this back to Jackson Pollock. Because remember, Pollock said that it is the making of the art, this sort of almost ritualistic dance of him taking his brushes and dripping paint onto the canvas. He says that's the art. And so in many ways, what performance artists did is they kind of left out the canvas. And now there's this idea that art can be an event, it can be an action, it can be a person doing something. I mean, if art can be a urinal, guys, it can be it can be a guy holding a dead rabbit while being painted with gold. What? All right, so you're looking at a German artist named Joseph Beuys, who was a pilot in World War II, a German pilot, and who claimed that his plane crashed in a very remote area of Russia, and that he was rescued and literally sort of brought back to life by being stored, and this gets weird and a little gross, in animal fat. And so for him, it was kind of a rebirth. He came out of this and born again, sort of physically, like he was near death, and since he was rescued by these sort of people who lived this kind of tribal life, and took him in and stored him in animal fat and warmed him up in the cold Russian winter, he was sort of reborn through this kind of organic process. Now, there's a lot of people who doubt whether this story is actually true, and I don't know. That in itself could be a performance, right? But a lot of his work deals with this concept of spirituality, the concept of rebirth, and this work, How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hare, he covered his face with gold leaf, which is a material used a lot in ancient art, especially in early Christian and medieval art. And gold leaf is often meant to represent divinity. It's meant to represent sort of sort of the everlasting presence of God, because since gold is a material that does not tarnish, it does not rust, it has often been associated with the divine. So by coating his face in gold, he's sort of referencing this. Why a rabbit? Well, because rabbits are often associated with rebirth. I mean, why do you think we have the Easter bunny associated with Easter, an event that celebrates the rebirth of the resurrection of Christ? And happens to take place in the spring, where everything is sort of born again, because rabbits are related to fertility and growth and rebirth. And this whole sort of event, this performance, is meant to sort of represent, in some ways, the artistic process, which, is a little bit about divine inspiration, leading to the birth of an idea. But performance art really sort of emerges not only from the art world, but also from the world of music. And there's a guy named John Cage, who is a musician, who started experimenting with all sorts of different ways and new ways of making music. And a lot of his music relied heavily on the concept of chants. Oh my God, there's that term again. But this idea that art often depends on chance, and it often depends on sort of the relationship between the viewer and the artist, and that there is a lot of things that happen between what the viewer sees and what the artist creates is chance, right? We're all going to have our own sort of reactions. And in fact, he created this work called 4 minutes and 33 seconds. I'm going to put a link to a video performance of it. But it's a musical piece where the conductor starts the piece, the orchestra gets their instruments ready, and they remain silent for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The idea is that the performance is actually not made by the musicians, but it's made by the audience. And in that silence, the audience shifts in their chair and they cough. They might even start talking to each other a little bit, or they move around. And all of a sudden, that is actually the performance. Because as Duchamp sort of showed us, you can't have art with just an artist. You have to have the participation of the viewer. And so John Cage is like, well, let's just break that wall down completely. And so for him, for John Cage, the act of sitting and observing art is as necessary for the completion of the art as it is what the musician or the artist or whatever is doing. Okay, so this leads to a kind of art that begins in the 1960s called happenings. A guy named Alan Capral was a student of Cage, and he would create these events. Happenings were events where they would say what they would sort of let everybody know what was going to happen, but then they wouldn't really plan anything beyond that. So the idea is, all right, at 8 o'clock on Monday night, we're all going to meet and we're all going to draw on a piece of paper. Okay, great. We don't know what we're going to draw. We don't know how we're going to draw it. We're not sure what's going to happen. But it is the idea that all of a sudden there's a blurred line between the artist and the viewer. And now in happenings, which are a kind of performance art, The viewer actually ends up participating directly in the art. There's a whole group of artists that came out of this known as Fluxus, who were incredibly instrumental in sort of legitimizing and bringing performance art to the masses. They had their own version, which they referred to as events. But really, these are all sort of forms of performance art and different forms of what we know now as happenings. But happenings are sort of like these big events where there is no real artist. It's just everybody kind of shows up and does something. Carol Schneemann is another artist who very much created happenings. And nope, that's not true. Carol Schneemann is an artist very much part of performance art. She often used her body as the focus of performance art. She created this work here called Meet Joy, which is a performance where she and other people performed rolling around nude in a bunch of meat. It was meant to be as repulsive as it sounds. In many ways, she, like a lot of art that is associated kind of with the postmodernist movement, she is taking sort of concepts that had been part of the art world for centuries. The nude figure, the woman as a object of men's desire. And she's taken this and she's turned it into something confrontational, something that is meant to repulse instead of titillate. But if you sort of look sort of deeper, she's actually using the same kinds of concepts and ideas that have been inherent in Western art. But like postmodernist architecture kind of took all those things and literally turned them inside out, she is too. So instead of the model being this painted static image that the viewer, and in this case mostly men, are allowed to just kind of look at their convenience. Now, by presenting this live body that is doing something sort of repulsive, she is sort of flipping the whole idea of what a nude woman in art can be and should do. Conceptual art. It just gets weirder, guys. It just gets weirder. And I'm really sad I'm not here seeing your reactions to some of this stuff. I'm staring in a camera and occasionally looking down at my image here in the lower right. And this is not the ideal way to teach this stuff, but alas, here we are. So conceptual art. So conceptual art, the central idea of conceptual art is the artfulness of art is in the idea, not in the execution. And I think the best example of this is really the first, and that is in Marcel Duchamp's Fountain. Remember the urinal? Because the urinal itself, the object itself, wasn't important. He could have picked anything. He could have picked a rubber chicken. He could have picked a crock pot. He could have picked anything and entered it. Any object that was shocking or weird. What Duchamp's art really was the fact that he got a bunch of people to consider a urinal to be art. That is the art. The concept that art can be anything as long as enough people agree that it's art is the art. And so it is the concept that is important, not ultimately the execution. We're not talking about turning art on its head. Now we can have art that doesn't have to have art in it. It can just be an idea. And this is a work by Joseph Kosuth called 1 and 3 Chairs. And this is about the concept of a chair, how chairs can exist in different forms. They can exist as a definition of a chair. A chair can exist as a picture of a chair, or it can be an actual chair. They're all different aspects of the same thing. They're all concepts of a chair, just different versions of that chair. I'm not saying this stuff is easy, and I'm not saying that you have to like it, but art now is becoming, in this postmodern period, in the 1970s, art is literally being turned on its head. And artists are starting to reevaluate the whole idea of what art is, what art can be, what art is made with. And thanks to Duchamp and this sort of concept that art is whatever the viewer agrees that art, whatever the viewer agrees to, then there's no rules anymore. Art can be whatever we want it to be. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing. But I know there are some students who just immediately write off conceptual art or write off performance art. And I don't think that's fair, because I think like all kinds of art, there's good conceptual art and there's bad conceptual art, just like there's good painting and bad painting. And if you've ever seen any of my paintings, you would know there are some bad paintings, right? But there's you know, I don't think we should let the style or the medium turn us off immediately. I guess I'm asking you guys for an open mind here, because this is where we are. This art is still very much a part of the contemporary art world. And the idea of a conceptual art is still very much a sort of foundation of a lot of art that is continuing to today. Bruce Nauman is another artist who deals with conceptual art. He works with a lot of different materials. Some of his art is actual physical objects. He often works with things like neon light, modernist materials. But he also experiments with performance, as you can see his rather humorous self-portrait as a fountain. I think that a lot of postmodern art, whether it's conceptual art or whether it's performance art, is often meant to be absurd and funny and ridiculous. And we're not often used to seeing art that doesn't necessarily take itself seriously. And I think there's some of this art throws us off a little bit, because if art doesn't take itself seriously, or if it's asking us to kind of be in on the joke, that's for so much of us what art is not supposed to be at all. Art is supposed to be this serious thing that we're supposed to take really seriously, and it's supposed to sort of make us better people. That's what the whole Renaissance is about, right? Art sort of is meant to bring out our better natures, and postmodernism says, why? Why can't art be whatever we want it to be? Why can't it be made with whatever we want it to be? Why can't it address whatever issues we want it to address? Video art is art made with video. And this can include artists filming their own performances, or it can include artists who use special effects and things like that. So artists started using video in the early 1970s. Some artists had experimented with film before, but film is really expensive. And it was not affordable to many struggling artists. But in the late 1960s, early 1970s, video equipment started to become commercially available, and it was a lot more affordable. And videotape is way, way less expensive than film. And so this really started to free up artists. And one of the pioneer artists is a Korean-American artist named Nam June Paik. And Nam June Paik is, in some ways, kind of the father of the modern music video. And he's also the father of the remix and the mashup. His earliest videos were taking clips from musical performances, from commercials, from things that he shot himself with a video camera, and then combining those with sort of really early kind of crude video effects. He would make these sort of montage movies set to music with sort of flashes of, you know, commercials and people dancing and all of these other things. And they were you know, you look at them today and some of them almost seem like they could be memes. But he's an absolutely important, he's an incredibly important artist in the history of modern, and I should say postmodern art, because he's one of the fathers of video art. And this is going to have a huge influence on art all the way up to today. And here's some more stills from this. Global Groove is the name of this particular work, and is really one of the first video examples of video art. Okay, guys, that's it. Thanks for sticking with me on this really weird, wild journey through the postmodernist landscape. I'll see you next time.